Oh, good morning. And firstly, may I say well done to Anne and Catherine for their readings. Not very easy readings, lots of hard words. And it's a long passage, isn't it? But it's oh my. Is that better? Oh, that is definitely better. But at the beginning, David is king, isn't he? And if you are familiar with 1 Samuel, or you were here maybe last year as you went through 1 Samuel, you'll know that David's had to wait a long time for this, hasn't he? He's been waiting in the wilderness, fleeing from Saul, but finally, David is king at the beginning of this passage. And so you might be thinking, when we arrive there, party time for David. God's promised king is finally on the throne, the kingdom has come. And yet, stuff kept getting in the way, didn't it? As you heard our reading this morning, there was messy politics, there was mindless violence, there was murder. Very long, messy journey. And you may have thought it all felt very pointless. You might have thought, why is all this happening? Why all this mess? Why couldn't we just have powerful King David arriving on the scene straight away, taking the kingdom by force? Surely that would be much better than all the murder and bloodshed of this passage. And some of us might be thinking that about our situation now in a slightly different way. Why doesn't God just grow his kingdom suddenly and dramatically now? Jesus, after all, has become king for us. Why doesn't everyone see that he is king and Jesus grow his kingdom suddenly? Well, God's kingdom is not about looking powerful. It's not about instant success or easy victories. It's a kingdom that grows slowly and under the radar and through the most unlikely of ways. So we begin with opposition to God's kingdom. Opposition to God's kingdom. Now, this first point, first 3 verses, we're going to go a lot slower on these first 3. After that, don't worry, we'll pick it up after that. So, David has just been made king, but in the previous passage, in chapter 2, verse 4, he's been made king of Judah. Now, Judah isn't quite the whole of Israel, it's one of the tribes. So, in verse 8, we meet probably the big player in our passage this morning, and it's Abner. Okay. Now, there's quite a few characters in our passage this morning, so to try and help us understand who's doing what, when I'm standing over here, I'm talking about people opposing David, okay? So that's Abner to start off with, Abner over here. When I'm over here, okay, I'm going to talk about people who are with David, who are on his side, or supposedly on his side at least. Okay. So, Abner, definitely over here, opposing David. And in verse 8, our author wants us to know that he is the son of Ner. And that means he's Saul's cousin. And so he doesn't like the idea that David's king. He fancies himself back in the glory days of Saul. So he gets Saul's son, Ishbosheth. Obviously, Ishbosheth, also over here, opposing David. Okay. So, an Ish from the get-go, as I'm just going to call him Ish, okay? Oh, that's okay. Ish from the get-go really doesn't have much going for him because of his name, okay? Ishbosheth, man of shame. And not just being called man of shame. It's just not going to go very well for you, is it? But that's his name, man of shame. And in verse 9, Abner makes Ish king over the rest of Israel. But he's not king for all the time that David is king. In verse 10 and 11, you hear that David is king for 7 years, and then you hear that Ishbosheth is king for like 2 years, something like that, isn't it? So that means there's 5 years before Ishbosheth is king that David is king in Hebron. And so that's 5 years when David is in Hebron as king, and he must just be waiting. We don't really know what's happening in that time. What we do know is that after those 5 years, we then have this opposition. instead of after 5 years there being a solution, there is instead, it seems, things getting worse. So the stage has been set. God's chosen king is king over Judah, and the pretender king is king over the rest, Ishbosheth. Now it's important to note at this stage who the real enemy here is. Okay, who's the real enemy over here? You might think it's Ishbosheth, but in reality the real enemy is Abner, because he's the one who's really in control. He's the one who is in control of Ishbosheth. David, the true king, has come. He's been coronated. Well, not coronated, but he's been anointed king. And yet, David, like Jesus, has not been received by his own people. Abner, then, is a classic picture of the human condition of not recognizing who is king, who his king is. A condition which continues to this day. Now, Jesus is king. He reigns in heaven, and yet his dominion, his rule, his authority is not recognized by many, many people in our world. David, at this stage, has a small kingdom around him in Hebron, waiting. And Jesus now has a kingdom throughout the world, but gathered in local churches, in us. By grace, we have come to understand that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the King. But if it wasn't for that, we would be just like Abner, wanting to set up our own kingdom in opposition to the true King. Now, it may look like, things are going nowhere. It may look like things are hard. Oppositions can arise. Like after 5 years, opposition rises for David. But this could be a change in culture. This could be, division in the church. But we always need to keep coming back to our King and to trust his timing. Because we're going to see, as we go through this morning, that God will bring his kingdom, but he'll do it in his timing and in his way. So as we move on, we'll see that people have their own ideas though. So human ambition and God's kingdom. Human ambition and God's kingdom. So we have Ish set up as king, and Abner goes forth. We meet a new character, and he's called Joab. And Joab is in David's army. So Joab in David's army looks like he's on his side, on David's side. But have a look with me at verse 13 of chapter 2. Verse 13. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out to meet them. That's basically going to meet Abner at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat on one side of the pool, and one group sat on the other. Now there's a little word in there that they kind of missed, which is that they came together. So when it says they met them, it meant they met together. And I think the author uses that for a reason. I think he's trying to show us that what's about to happen is as much Abner's initiative as it is Joab's initiative. Or it's as much Joab's initiative as it is Abner's initiative. So what happens? Well, it's awful, isn't it? You've got these 12 men coming together. You kind of imagine them coming up one line and another, one line coming towards the other. And they just go towards each other, grab each other by the head, stab them and dagger them aside. And just imagine being one of those guys doing that, looking around, and then realising, same has happened to me, same has happened to every other man here. And you just realise, it's pointless, isn't it? It's not worked at all. Absolutely, it's an absolute mess, isn't it? So both Abner and Joab think they've got the political prowess to figure out the other guy, but it just doesn't work, does it? And they're both conspiring to bring their own kingdom. Abner, in his pride, is trying to raise up his own kingdom through Ishbosheth. But I think that Joab is trying to bring David's kingdom through his own clever tactics as well. They together, remember that word together, sought to find a wise solution to this problem, but it fails in miserable fashion, doesn't it? And why does it fail? I think it's to show us God is the one that's going to bring the kingdom, and he's going to do it in his timing and in his way, not through the politics of men. So then we meet a guy called Asahel, and Asahel also in David's army, okay? And as the battle goes on, Asahel starts to pursue Abner. And so you might be thinking, okay, Asahel, I like that. Yeah, you go, Asahel. You chase down that bad guy, Abner. Well, I think if we look at chapter 2, verse 17, you see the battle is very fierce, and Abner and the Israelites were defeated by David's men. So the battle is very clearly David's men winning. And yet what is Asahel doing? Asahel is pursuing Abner. And I think he's doing this because he wants the glory. See, he's listed as the youngest of the brothers with Joab in verse 18. And he's also given plenty of warning by Abner, isn't he? Abner knows he's the stronger warrior. He's given him plenty of warning. But Asahel is on the offensive, and Abner is on the defensive. So Abner, therefore, has every right to turn around and act in self-defense and kill him. So I think Asahel, just like Joab, is trying to bring in David's kingdom by force, his way. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work because God will bring his kingdom in his timing and in his way. Joab, understandably, becomes angry at Abner, chases him, and ironically, Abner, the guy who started all this, by raising up Ishbosheth, tells Joab to pack it in and says the bloodshed has been enough. And then we hear the battle reports. David's men lost 20, Abner 360. And we get a summary at the beginning of chapter 3. Long war. David stronger, Saul's house getting weaker. But it's interesting, it says David gets stronger, isn't it? Because we haven't actually heard anything about David, have we? Because David has been waiting. David knows that God's going to bring his time, he's going to bring his kingdom in his timing and in his way. He can't do it by force. David knows that he is merely God's instrument. And at this time, in this place, God is not using David as he does in other ways. And I think this is a good reminder for us as well. Obviously, we're not God's chosen king. We're not the one to bring in God's kingdom in the way that David would. But we are those who are people who can speak God's kingdom to others and cause it to grow through that. Although God is the one that causes it. And sometimes, God could use us in really awesome ways. God could grow his kingdom very quickly through us. But at other times, God's going to grow his kingdom without us. We'll be sitting back waiting. So we've got to keep our human ambition in check. It's been great seeing, Causeway grow even while I've been here. But it's important as well to look to those who waited, who came before us and prayed, and are still with us, and who prayed, and remembering that they're just as faithful. But what about now? What might be our temptation now? How might we be tempted to be a bit like Asahel, to kind of be on the front line, pushing the kingdom growth, but so that others would see? Maybe, for example, you might have had a friend come to church or a church event, and as that's been happening, you've kind of been looking around and you've been like, I'm the one that's really, pushing the gospel forward here. Look at me. And then kind of looking down on others. I mean, you wouldn't say anything out loud, that would be terribly un-British. But you've just got that sneaky kind of feeling down inside that you're the one that's really doing the work here, and no one else is. It might not be that. It might be actually that you're someone who thinks you are actually one of those prayer warriors, one of the few people that's actually on the front line praying. Or you might think you're one of the few people in church who actually really knows quite a few non-Christians, whereas all those other people just spend time with Christians. But whatever it is, we've got to remember that what we do is not what makes the difference. God is the one who sets the agenda. And I think God setting the agenda is something that is emphasised as we hear about David's sons after this. I think these sons it's not a good list, I don't think. It's not a positive list. It mentions Amnon, it mentions Absalom, and when those guys come up later on in 2 Samuel, it's not going to be good. I think this is another way that the author is trying to emphasise that God is the one causing these victories, not David. God's the one bringing the kingdom, and it's in his timing and in his way. And that means in time, all those who oppose God's kingdom will be brought down. And that's what we see as we move on to the collapse of human kingdoms, the collapse of human kingdoms. So at the heart of the rebellion against David is Abner. Abner is really the linchpin. He is the pillar, he is the backbone to the house of Saul. And so I hope you can see with me that the collapse of Saul's house really comes in chapter 3 verse 7. Chapter 3 verse 7, it says, "Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, son of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, 'Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?'" And then after that, Abner just kind of gets angry, but he doesn't really kind of deny what Ishbosheth's accusation is. So therefore, it probably seems probable that Abner really did do this. And Ishbosheth is angry because Abner sleeping with one of Saul's concubines is like trying to make a take for the throne itself. To try and take Saul's concubine is to try and take Saul's throne. And so what we've got here is the human ambition of Ishbosheth, the human ambition of Abner, coming to a head, coming to a loggerhead, each trying to do their own will. And what happens? They part ways. Abner now makes his way over to the kingdom of David, leaving Ishbosheth looking very, very weak. And the language that Abner uses to describe going over to kind of David's kingdom, it seems pretty strong, isn't it? We might have thinking, maybe Abner's kind of woken up. Maybe he finally sees that who really is king and it's David. And, he doesn't just leave it at words either, does he? He also speaks, does many things for David. He does many things to try and help David as king. And he tries to bring more people over to David's side. And then David accepts him at a feast. Now look at chapter 3, verse 21. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. And that last sentence might make us think, Abner's been accepted by David. And this all seems, these good words, these good actions, they all seem like good things for Abner to be doing. But I think at the heart of it, he still has a heart full of human ambition. Abner may have switched allegiance to the king, but he has not switched the allegiance of his heart. He is still very much focused on himself. None of you noticed, he's very self-centered when he says these things. So in chapter 3 verse 12 he says, "Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." And then in verse 21, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king." He's trying to be God. He's trying to be the one that will bring in the kingdom. According to Abner, Abner is the one who will bring David's kingdom in Abner's timing and in Abner's way. He wants to be the big dog of the kingdom. Having failed to be the second-hand man in Ishbosheth's kingdom, he now wants to be the second-hand man in David's kingdom. But, just a moment, we've already met David's second-hand man in his kingdom, haven't we? And that's Joab. Joab is the big dog in David's kingdom at the moment, and he's not going to let go of that easily, is he? So we heard he craftily murders him. It's worth noting that Joab definitely does the wrong thing here. Joab definitely does the wrong thing. Asahel died in battle. He wasn't murdered. There is no justification for murdering Abner. And yet Joab does it all the same. So here we have two men, Abner and Joab, both going into David's kingdom for themselves, both wanting to be big deals, one murdered by the other. And spoiler alert for Joab, he's later going to get struck down for life as well. All who are in God's kingdom for their own gain will be brought down. And you know, there will be people in our churches as well who are in it for their own gain. Maybe not right now in this church, but certainly in churches around the world, probably even churches in Britain, maybe in our church in the future. Jesus says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Outwardly they might look like to be doing the right thing, to be growing the kingdom, but inside they're in it for personal gain. Jesus says you'll know them by their fruit. So let me say to you today, if you're producing that fruit, if you're repentant of that sin, which we never see Abner or Joab do, by the way, then you're not going to get brought down by God at all. But what David does next, gives us a little picture of that. David wants to kind of distance himself as much as possible from this evil. He knows that what Joab's done is wrong, and he wants people to know that too. So he clearly and publicly mourns for Abner. So we are to watch for those who are in the kingdom, maybe in the church for their own gain. But also be comforted that if you are distancing yourself from sin, then that isn't you. But all who are in God's kingdom for their own gain will be brought down. And as we see, all who oppose David's kingdom will be brought down too. So the narrator turns back to Ishbosheth, and the last guy over here, the last guy left in the kingdom of Saul. And what the narrator does, he paints a picture of a kingdom with no hope. Ishbosheth knows that Abner was the key to his campaign, and so does the rest of Israel. There's no hope left for Ishbosheth. And once again we meet two guys, and these two guys also in the kingdom, also in it for themselves, aren't they? They see an opportunity to get in with David. So they kill Ishbosheth, they bring David the head, and by now we know, don't we? We know that human ambition is not going to work in God's kingdom. So David executes them for murder. All who come to God's kingdom for their own gain will be brought down. And Ishbosheth is dead. And David's opponents, the kingdom of Saul, has kind of brought this upon themselves, really. This human ambition of themselves, fighting against each other, has caused the collapse of their rebellion. It's been a slow, gradual descent to nothingness. Meanwhile, David has been sitting back waiting. And slowly but surely, his kingdom has become more and more secure. Let's just notice for a moment how that's happened. David's kingdom has become more secure because of the wickedness of those who opposed him. Remember, there was those 5 years before Ishbosheth was set up as king. But now, after these 2 years of war, which was started by the wickedness of Abner, the rebellion has crumbled, has fallen in on itself. Meanwhile, David has become stronger. And as we'll see in chapter 5, he has been raised up. At the beginning of Samuel, so 1 and 2 Samuel kind of go together as one big book. So at the beginning of Samuel, we hear a prayer from Hannah. And Hannah prays a prayer, and she says this: "The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and makes them inherit a throne of honour. Behind this entire story, God has been working. He has been humbling the proud, and he has been raising the humble. As the house of Saul has had this slow trajectory down, the house of David has had a steady trajectory up. At the end of this prayer, Hannah says this: "Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." The Lord has been giving strength to his king, and the Lord has been judging Asahel, Abner, Joab, and Ishbosheth. God has been bringing his kingdom in his timing and in his way, and all those who have opposed him have been brought down. Remember at the beginning we were thinking about how much more impressive this would have just been if David had just kind of taken the throne straight away. Well, I hope you've seen that in these chapters we've been given a wonderful picture of how God's kingdom, of what life in God's kingdom is like, of how God's kingdom works. It's not about quickly seizing the throne. It's about God using the most unlikely of ways to bring about his kingdom. And we see that no more clearly than at the cross of Jesus. Jesus in his life, he was opposed throughout his ministry. He did not seize the throne. He did not battle his enemies. He waited while evil men conspired, and while they were humbled, he was raised up. Through their actions, he became our king as he died and rose again. Nothing the Pharisees could do could stop Jesus bringing the kingdom. In fact, it was what they did that brought about Jesus bringing the kingdom. God brought the kingdom in his timing and in his way, and those who opposed it could not stand in its way. But even now that Jesus is king, his kingdom, as we said at the beginning, is yet to be revealed to many. And so for us, there is still waiting now. So as we finish, I'd love to just focus on a couple of things. Firstly, don't panic when things go wrong. I'm sure if you've been in churches for any length of time, you know that stuff goes wrong, doesn't it? You say something to someone you wish you hadn't. You forget to bring something to church you should have brought. Or there's just a major disruption in church because of something maybe your child has done. And in the moment, feels like, what I've just said sounds really small, doesn't it? It's like, no, it's not a big deal. But in the moment, feels like literally the end of the world. Remember at the beginning, David has been king for 5 years, and then the uprising begins. To us, if we were on David's side, that would seem dreadful. But for God, it was the way that David would bring in the full kingdom. God has the most amazing tendency of turning what seems bad into the most awesome, majestic and beautiful of things. Messing something up in church life is not going to stop him. And we can trust our God to use our mess for his glory. But secondly, if that's the case, then what's the best thing we can be doing right now? If God is the one that brings the kingdom in his timing, in his way, what is the best thing we can do? It's to pray, isn't it? To turn to the Lord in prayer. God is the one growing his kingdom. We want it to grow. We need to ask him. And that's what the start of the Lord's Prayer is all about, isn't it? It says, "Our Father in heaven," our Father who is enthroned, who is reigning over us all. "Hallowed be your name. May your name be reign over more. Your kingdom come." Your kingdom come. Not our kingdom, your kingdom. This is the day in, day out prayer for a Christian. And so let me encourage you that this would be your day in, day out prayer for this week. Pray that God's kingdom would grow every day this week through praying the Lord's Prayer. So let's begin now. Let's respond to what we've heard by praying the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. Well, we know that we are weak, but that God can perform wondrous works through us as He brings His kingdom. So let's continue to cry out to God for help as we sing this last song. Let's stand and sing.